My name is Susan, and I am a 62-year-old homemaker. My husband Joseph was an office worker but retired last March and is now re-employed. We live in a place surrounded by farms, and many of the people here are farmers. During the farming season, I help out relatives and local farmers. We have 2 children, and we used to live with our oldest son and his wife. Our second son, John, lives in a nearby town in a used house. Our second son's wife is laid back and a bit airheaded, but she's a lovable and adorable wife. On the other hand, our oldest son's wife, Jessica, who lives with us, is quite responsible, and I thought she was just right for our careless eldest son, Danielle. However, she might be too responsible, worrying about our family's future. As my husband's retirement was approaching, she was thinking about what's next even more than we were. My father-in-law's salary will drop significantly once he's retired. That means we won't be able to live as we have been. She said this with a scary face to my husband and me, so I thought she would take over managing the household finances. Before my husband retired, his salary covered most of our living expenses. Our oldest son also contributed to the living expenses every month, but honestly, it wasn't enough to cover his family and our 5-year-old grandchild. I didn't know how much our oldest son was earning, but since our oldest son's wife was working full-time, I assumed they were doing fine. I took care of all the housework, including dropping off and picking up our grandchild from kindergarten. On holidays, they often left our grandchild with me and went out to play, leaving our oldest son behind. My husband complained to our oldest son about his carefree wife several times.
Did Jessica go out to play again? She's always demanding things but does whatever she wants.
Our oldest son, who does whatever his wife says, could only laugh it off. As my husband says, our oldest son's wife always interferes with our actions. When our grandchild was born, my husband bought a minivan so we could all ride together. But our oldest son's wife immediately intervened. Such a big car is inefficient if we're not going out as a family every day. She made a visibly uncomfortable face even though my husband was paying for the whole car. However, when the car was delivered, our oldest son's wife started using the minivan as the main vehicle, and even the gas card was in my husband's name. If we planned to go to a resort as a family on a weekend, our oldest son's wife would get angry on the day. I'm going out with my friends today, so I will use the minivan. Once she said that, she never changed her mind, and our oldest son's wife ended up using the minivan. It was strange that our oldest son's wife, who was so against buying the minivan, was the one using it the most. Our oldest son was even more interfered with, becoming like a servant to his wife. When our oldest son went to a dinner party with his colleagues shortly after they were married, his wife was furious when he returned home. If you are going to be late, let me know in advance. The oldest son had mentioned a dinner party earlier, but his wife Jessica seemed to have completely forgotten about it. Even when my husband and I intervened trying to soothe Jessica, her anger did not subside. My life's rhythm gets thrown off, so from now on, no more dinner parties. It was a selfish demand, but since our oldest son has a quiet nature, he silently agreed without arguing. Watching Jessica berate our oldest son even in front of her father-in-law and mother-in-law, I felt anxious, thinking that this marriage was a mistake. Our oldest son's salary is entirely controlled by Jessica, and he receives only a small allowance. I felt sorry for him having to pay for his lunch from that little money, so I gave him a lunchbox. Jessica didn't seem to like the lunchbox either and complained to me. Don't send him off with a lunchbox without asking me. It affects our budget. I was so frustrated that I snapped back at her. The lunchbox's ingredients were bought with Joseph's money. So Jessica, don't interfere. Stunned by my words, Jessica couldn't argue back and reluctantly accepted the lunchbox for our eldest son. We were also taken aback by Jessica's attitude when our grandchild was born. During childbirth, Jessica had returned to her parents' house, and even after coming back, she seemed to have little interest in caring for the baby. Since I adored my grandchild, I looked after him all day, but Jessica laughingly said to me, "Mother-in-law, you should thank me. You can take care of your grandchild because of me." Seeing Jessica speak so arrogantly, I realized that she was different from us because Jessica doesn't care for the grandchild. He does not bond with her at all. Whenever something happens, the grandchild clings to me or my husband, and Jessica didn't find that amusing either. Even for kindergarten events, Jessica would show reluctance and say it's bothersome. "Mother-in-law can go, right? It's none of my business." Although she probably wants to get along with her child, Jessica just can't make it work. Recently, she apparently went to pick up her child from kindergarten, a rare occasion, but he cried saying he didn't want to go home with her. When I went to pick him up after receiving a call from the kindergarten, I saw my grandchild running towards me with a beaming smile while Jessica had a complicated expression on her face. Lately, Jessica's main concern is about my husband and me after retirement. We had been telling our oldest son and Jessica for quite some time that my husband will be rehired after retiring, but Jessica always worried about his salary decreasing. I finally decided to propose something to Jessica. If Joseph is rehired, shall we leave the household finances to you, Jessica? Jessica glared at me with a fierce look, but after thinking for a moment, she answered, "So you mean that I will be in charge of this house?" I nodded. That was my intention. Oldest son's wife, looking perplexed, nevertheless smiled and said, "I understand from now on I will take charge of everything." Her smile was airy. But starting in April, when my husband was rehired, we decided to entrust the household finances to our oldest son and his wife. From the next day, the oldest son's wife handed me papers to record the utilities, monthly payments, and food expenses individually. The monthly payments could be seen on our banking cards, but the food costs were only roughly known. When I filed in an approximate amount, the oldest son's wife yelled at me, "You have been buying groceries like this? How pathetic. You are a typical incompetent housewife." I felt like bursting into anger, but I wanted to see how well she could manage things. From April, we planned to live on the salaries of our oldest son and his wife, paying only our share of the food and utilities. But then the oldest son's wife demanded the same amount as before. "I expect father-in-law to contribute the same amount every month," she said. My husband, surprised, immediately replied,
"Aren't we living on Daniel and Jessica's salaries now?"
To my husband's words, the oldest son's wife responded with a laugh. "What are you talking about? I'm only deciding how to distribute and pay. Father-in-law will pay as before." We didn't understand what she was saying, and she added, "If you can't pay the usual money, please leave this house. You two outdated nuisances are in the way." Called outdated nuisances, my husband couldn't stand it any longer.
"How dare you talk to your parents like that? If we were a nuisance, we'll leave."
It was rare to see my usually gentle husband so angry. We went to our room to discuss our future. I was worried about what we would do if we left, so I asked my husband, "What will we do if we leave this house?" My husband replied calmly, as if his earlier anger was a lie.
"We plan to go to John's house. I've already talked to him."
Surprised by his unexpected words, my husband continued with a happy face,
"Let's give that arrogant oldest son's wife and sloppy Daniel a taste of their own medicine."
I still didn't understand what my husband was saying, but I decided to trust him. Our oldest son, who had heard that his wife wanted us to leave, was panicking alone. And, unable to stop her, a truly pitiful son. My husband had already begun preparing for the move, and I started packing too. The oldest son's wife, a little surprised to see that we were really moving, kept making snide comments as we packed. "Be prepared. I'll throw away all the stuff you leave behind. You outdated nuisance couple are slow in preparing for the move." I had always thought she was awful, but now she seemed to be showing her true colors, hurling one insult after another. "Don't you think about leaving some inheritance for your grandchildren, since you don't have much time left in life?" I had never seen my oldest son's wife so intense before, and I was stunned. But after she left, my husband was laughing.
"She must be thrilled thinking she can make this house and land her own."
The area is rural, so there are many large houses, but ours is one of the most impressive ones. The house is old, but we have fixed it up many times so we can still live in it. The land is quite spacious, so if we wanted to build single-family homes, there's enough room for 4 or 5. A week after being told to leave this outdated nuisance of a house, my oldest son's wife came to me with a pleased look on her face. "Are you ready to move?" My husband replied with a smile just as big as hers.
"We'll be out by tomorrow. Don't worry."
We had already moved most of our belongings and only the valuables were left. My oldest son's wife didn't seem to care where we were moving to. She just wanted us out of the house. The next day, as we were leaving, she saw us off at the front door with a confident posture. Our oldest son was hiding in the shadows looking guilty, and I was disgusted with him for being so controlled by his wife. Our grandchild didn't seem to know I was leaving and was crying in his father's arms. Leaving the house wasn't that sad, but I felt like crying for our left-behind grandchild. We headed straight to our second son's house and began unpacking. In stark contrast to my oldest son's wife, my second son's wife is always smiling and makes everything fun. When my second son got married, he bought a used single-family home and my husband helped financially. The house was too big for just the two of them, so I once asked him, "Why did you need to buy such a big house?" He replied with something profound.
Dad told me to buy a slightly bigger house since he was giving me money. He was the one who introduced me to this house in the first place.
I wondered why my husband had found a house big enough for two families when we already had our own. Looking back, was he anticipating being kicked out of our house? My second son and his wife, who don't have children yet, were living alone in this big house. They said they had been lonely, but now it would be livelier with us around. My second son's wife works but takes care of the housework and everything was in order. When I offered to help, she shyly asked, I'm bad at cooking, so I would like you to teach me, mother-in-law." My second son, who had been listening, said with an exasperated face,
"That's right, my wife's cooking has a strange and mysterious taste, so please teach her properly, Mom."
Indeed, the meal my second son's wife made that day was all dishes we had never seen before, and both my husband and I were surprised. A month after moving, we had heard nothing from our oldest son, and we had settled into life in our second son's house, as if we had always lived there. However, a few days later, I received a panic call from my oldest son's wife. "Mother-in-law, the neighbors are talking about church donations and stuff, and someone claiming to be father-in-law's nephew told us to leave the house. What's going on?" My oldest son's wife seemed confused, and I was equally baffled by her one-sided rant. I tried to calm her down. She still seemed panicked, but something occurred to me. For generations, the people living in that house had served as church elders for a nearby church, and we had to collect donations every year. I remember my husband and I splitting the task and going around the neighborhood to gather contributions. We were also responsible for managing a nearby communal cemetery, collecting maintenance fees, taking care of the grounds. My husband, overhearing my conversation with my oldest son's wife, grabbed the phone and yelled at her,
"Our family has been the landlords of that area for generations, so we had to take care of everything."
He continued with a triumphant look on his face.
"I forgot to mention, but that house and land aren't mine. They belong to my brother, but now his son, my nephew, has inherited them."
I didn't know all the details, but I knew we were only borrowing the place. According to my husband, we were living rent-free in exchange for him taking over the church elder duties and cemetery management for his nephew. My husband had been covering the property taxes, and the maintenance must have been a relief for the nephew. For my husband, it was not only for the sake of his distant living nephew, but also to preserve the family home passed down through generations. With my husband's explanation, my oldest son's wife seemed to grasp the situation, and she snapped back at him. "I understand about the church, but why are we being told to leave?" she yelled without flinching. My husband explained with a sly smile.
"For quite some time, there has been a talk of developing the area around the house into residential land."
It seems the nephew had been holding off on the development out of consideration for us, but since we were kicked out, he told the nephew it was okay to proceed. The nephew was also furious after hearing about my oldest son's wife's heartless actions. Since she wouldn't take on the church elder or cemetery management duties, the nephew saw no need to be considerate and suddenly demanded that she vacate the house. Listening to this, I understood why my husband had encouraged our second son to buy a large house. Either way, my husband had been thinking that we would eventually have to leave that house, and he probably chose our second son as a cohabiting partner over our unreliable oldest son. From my perspective, both were unreliable, but comparing the two wives, a difference emerged. The calculating oldest son's wife, realizing she was at a disadvantage, quickly hung up. That night, my oldest son and his wife came to our second son's house, and my oldest son's wife asserted their rights. "Since we are living in that house now, father-in-law will find us a replacement, and of course he will pay the rent." My husband and second son were about to explode with anger at the selfish demands of my oldest son's wife. when my second son's wife interjected with an unrelented comment. Jessica, we bumped into each other in a strange place the other day, didn't we? At this sudden and inexplicable remark, my second son looked ready to erupt in anger, but his wife showed everyone her mobile phone. On the screen was an image of my oldest son's wife arm in arm with a man none of us had ever seen before. The moment she saw the picture, the color drained from my oldest son's wife's face. The second son's wife continued to press her. I work near that spot, so I have seen you there a few times, she said, showing more pictures one after the other. My oldest son's wife's previous bravado was gone, and she looked down trembling. Even my unreliable oldest son couldn't hold back and yelled,
"You've been cheating on me?"
Normally, one would give up at this point, but my oldest son's wife wasn't silent. That's right, I have been cheating. If you didn't have any assets, I would have never married a man like you. Whether defiant or proud, my oldest son's wife spat out her usual harsh words and left with one last parting shot. A man without a house or land? I'll be the one to break up with you. Without a single word of apology, she left my second son's house. Afterwards, my oldest son and his wife officially divorced. He took custody of their child and substantial compensation was demanded. With the evidence photos taken by my second son's wife, there was no way to deny it. My oldest son rented an apartment and lived with his child. But since we live nearby, I go over to take care of my grandchild. I was worried. They might be lonely without their mother, but they seem happier and more energetic without their disliked mother around. My oldest son's wife, after the divorce and losing the compensation money, borrowed money from her lover and was pressured to repay it, so she fled somewhere. It was probably good for my oldest son to part ways sooner, and all of this was thanks to my second son's wife's efforts. We recently found out that my second son's wife is expecting a baby. Though she often seems absent-minded, it turns out she's the most responsible of all, and I'm sure she will be a great mother. I'll have to take care of 2 grandchildren now, so I want to keep doing my best.